The most fundamental fear is a fear of the unknown. It's a fear so pervasive that every conceivable incarnation of horror can be rooted back to it. Every phobia, however irrational, can be traced back to the fear of physical or psychological harm, which can be traced back to death, which can be traced back to the endless void of the unknown. It can therefore be inferred that fear itself is a byproduct of what we don't know, but this poses the question of how exactly this concept can be interpreted, let alone portrayed. The malleable nature of fear doesn't help to narrow this down, as fear has been elicited through countless incarnations in the world of art, with each depiction building from what's already existed and only growing more hyperspecific with time. The reason the horror genre in art, and especially through audio-visual mediums like film, is so difficult to get right is because this natural evolution distills many of these fears to surface-level ideas, and ironically, makes them increasingly knowable. But I do think one film captures the very essence of fear better than any other, one as terrifying in its aggression as it is pure. That film being Tobe Hooper's exploitation masterpiece, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Left a huge Texaco refinery near the Texas-Louisiana border. 3 storage units.
To call The Texas Chainsaw Massacre one of the most important horror films of all time feels like an understatement. So much so to where you can pretty much slice the entire genre to what came before and what took from this movie. As is par for the course for any film with such a monumental influence, much of what Texas Chainsaw does has been distilled to a point where going back can make it seem tame, even downright pedestrian. But much like other films with such an influence, going back to the source reveals the rawest, most unfiltered exploration of its ideas, with certain intangible elements that have been lost to time. Texas Chainsaw is mostly remembered for its downright abrasive nature, feeling like an aggressive descent into the ugliest sides of humanity. As simple as the horror seems on the surface, I also believe there to be more subdued elements that allude to the circumstances it was born from and, ultimately, the concept of fear in its most primal state. The clearest and most documented examples of the more metaphorical elements of the film are found in its showcases of animal cruelty, as well as its exploration of sociopolitical decay in America. The violence throughout feels hedonistic, bordering on gratuity, but isn't too far off from the reality of how we treat the animals we consume on a daily basis. Why exactly is our tolerance for suffering so selective? Why is it so disturbing to see these maniacs indulge in human suffering when we take just as much enjoyment in the suffering inflicting upon other forms of life? We can comfortably think of ourselves as far more valuable than any pigs, but what does that matter when we squeal just the same in the face of pure terror? The visceral parallels that the film draws ties itself neatly to the broader politics that inspired it, so much so that its brutal portrayal still resonates deeply with today's political climate. The film immediately establishes America as a putrid land of disillusionment, with a blistering heat conveying a sense of discomfort not too far off from the political climate of the film. We find ourselves in a world of desperation, one where jobs and resources become increasingly scarce, and its people forced to resort to increasingly primal states in order to cling onto familiar traditions. The roles of the nuclear family are taken to its most perverse extremes, and exposes the hypocrisy of a supposedly fair nation, fueled by bloodthirsty indulgence. Our main cast of characters aren't so much people as they are a vehicle for perceived idealized American values, born from the suburban comfort of ignorance, coming to grips with the ugly truths of America. Not only serving as a blunt metaphor for the social decay and disillusionment following a post-Vietnam America, but also forcing people into the role of animals. The powerful grow increasingly gluttonous and, under capitalistic ritual, hunt down and slaughter the weak in a manufactured form of natural selection, where an adherence to tradition results in meaningless violence that borders on lunacy. The powerful have no goals or morals, their hypocrisy masked with the face of blood-stained tradition only fueling their need for violence, as their own microcosm of American values has reduced them to their most primal, animalistic state. Disregard any preconceptions of the world you thought you knew, because the harsh truths of reality turn its people into cattle under the slaughterhouse that is capitalism. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre doesn't just force its audience to come to grips with the ugly side of society, as its brutality isn't just a perversion of traditional American values. It's a showcase of what that foundation was built upon all along. America didn't become more hedonistically violent and corrupt during the 60s, it simply admitted it. The Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal are the most contemporary examples one could point to when leading up to the film's release, but historically, America, down to its very inception, has had a bloody history filled with corruption of power. It is with this lens that the horrors of the film become far more universal, intangible, unsettling, and undeniably American. The blunt force of a sledgehammer to the skull isn't a newfound level of depravity. you just weren't the one getting slaughtered before. The picture of America the film illustrates is akin to a corpse rotting in the blistering heat of a Texas sun, cannibalized by its people to constantly satiate and perpetuate its ever-increasing depravity. Our protagonist being violently picked off one by one has historically been read as a naive America coming to terms with its horrific reality that's been tucked under the rug throughout its history. But the reason it manages to be so horrifying runs a bit deeper than that. The plethora of slashers to follow would become too fixated with the more gratuitous elements of these films without recognizing the limitations that made Texas Chainsaw feel so much more real. Metaphorical elements aside, the budgetary limitations and desire for a lower age rating resulted in the film focusing less on gore and more on blunt kills with stark imagery. The jarring contrast between the documentary-like passivity of the filmmaking at the start to the abrasive brutality by the end has a gradually suffocating effect. Suffering doesn't feel romanticized for the sake of tension. The borderline mundanity of its violence and immediacy of death only makes those elements of horror linger for far longer. There is no obvious tension to be released by a payoff. The horror just happens, and as the initial shock settles, the gravity of what's just transpired, without rhyme or reason, becomes deeply unsettling. By the end, it feels far less like a horror movie, and more like staring into an unending void of uncertainty. There is no release, no explanation, or justification of what's just transpired, and no certainty of what's to come. All we're left with is chaos followed by the blunt, deafening silence of the unknown. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a truly timeless horror film, its classic status being cemented by the unprecedented amount of influence it's had. But far beyond that, it remains a masterpiece for its commitment to its unrelentingly blunt exploration of its horror, whether that be the social decay of a country with a blood-stained history, or as an unrelenting view of the unknowable void that is fear itself. And for better or for worse, its horror hasn't aged a day.